Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers, unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome back to the Formed Book Club and our discussion of St. Augustine's The City of God with selections and organization by Hans Urs von Balthasar. We have three sections left to discuss: the doctrine of the two kingdoms, the church's end time, and the supreme good and the last things. There's a lot in these last three sections. We may get through them in two sessions. Therefore, I want to mention right now up front that our next book will be by Henri de Lubac, The Church, Paradox and Mystery. Extraordinary book. And we'll probably take the first couple of chapters in our first session on this book. So, on to the Doctrine of the Two Kingdoms, where he really kind of runs through the gallery of ancient philosophers and kind of summarizes them and sees what's good in them and sees what's criticizable in them. I don't have too much in this section I want to comment on. One thing, though, is page 228, but do either of you have something before then?
Oh, yes, I do.
Good.
How about you, Joseph?
Well, I've got something actually at the bottom of the 213, right at the beginning.
Okay.
Let's start at the beginning.
Hey, that's an idea.
Do you trump me? Have you got anything above the bottom line of page 213, Vivian?
Well, I underlined that same section, so why don't you just start?
Well, I've just got the last few words on that page 213. For he rightly judged that gods represented in unfeeling images could easily be held in contempt. And I found something rather interesting here, because obviously this is before the iconoclasts and that controversy. But there's obviously a big difference between the use of images for devotional purposes and the worshipping of idols. I think that that's not clear here. Now, obviously, it might not be because it was a big issue. And I'm very aware, of course, that Augustine this is a work of apologetics against paganism. So, I'm very aware that we have to position him where he is and what he's trying to do. But I do think, that it's important for us to distinguish between the use of images as an assistance in prayer, as a way of edifying ourselves, as distinct from the use of idolatrous images. And there is obviously a very big difference, and I don't think it's very clear in this. I just wanted to sort of at least make that point.
I think it's important to understand the distinction that you're making, to understand what Augustine is doing in this chapter, and with this first fellow, Varro, in particular. I mean, Augustine is going through the different theologians, philosophies, schools of philosophy, schools of theology as such, and showing, where they're right and where they're wrong. And what was interesting to me about this first page, where Augustine dives into this Varro guy, of whom I know nothing, by the way, except for what I'm learning here in Augustine, is that this man, even though he's a pagan, the true things he does stumble upon. So, for example, this guy Varro said that, still on 213, the ancient Romans worshiped the gods without any image at all, and that if this practice had persisted, our worship of the gods would be more pure. So he's looking at paganism now in its most debauched form, including temple prostitution and all the things that are alluded to later in the chapter. And then this Varro guy manages to support his claim by citing the Jews, the witness of the Jewish people, and he does not hesitate to end this passage by asserting that those who first set up images of the gods for the people both reduced reverence and increased error in their cities. Now, what's so interesting to me about a pagan using the Jews to support his claim, we know that, Judaism and its strong prohibition against images is the antidote to idolatry in the ancient world. It's not until Christianity where now we have God taking flesh, and this was the argument used against the iconoclasts that you just mentioned, Joseph. Now that God has taken flesh, we do have an image. It's Jesus.
Yes.
And so that sort of changes our relationship a little bit. But the warning against pagan idolatry, and in all of its forms, is what's being talked about here.
Yeah, and I, of course, have no problem whatsoever with that. But even in Augustine's time, the Christians were painting images on the walls of the catacombs. Obviously, is the image of the cross and the crucifixion, and of course, these aren't idolatrous, but these are religious images. And it's just that it's not for certainly a modern Catholic reader. It's the clarification is not made, and therefore it's not clear. I just wanted to make that point. That's all. I'm not a criticism against Augustine, because I know what he's doing. He's not addressing that issue, but I do think that we don't want to get ourselves confused. That's all.
Well, that's clarified it. That's for sure. Anybody else before 228?
I've got 216. I'm obviously getting carried away here very enthusiastically, at least.
That's good.
Although
That's
I must
fine.
confess that the second half of the chapter I have less, but I've got a bit on the earlier pages.
Okay.
Well, there's also little places where Augustine is correcting the pagan record, if that's what you want to call it, even without necessarily doing it explicitly. So on the top of page 215, he mentions, as for happiness, he, meaning God, gives this only to the good. Slaves can have or have not happiness, and rulers can have or not have happiness, although full happiness will come only in the life where no one will be a slave any longer. And he knows very well that Aristotle said slaves could not be happy. I'm
not sure he knows that.
Well, maybe not that Aristotle says it specifically.
No, I know that Aristotle says it, but I don't think Aristotle came into the West.
Right. I thank you. Thank you for clarifying. It may not be. Well, we know that Augustine didn't know, but Augustine citing the Platonists, I think this debate must have existed even prior to Aristotle writing it in the books that we've read of his.
He does actually mention Aristotle in this chapter. I mean, it's only in passing, but he does say something.
Oh, that's right. Where is that,
more
Joseph?
Positive about him. So I think he's certainly aware of Aristotle. To the extent to which he's read him is another issue. But when he's going through the various Greek philosophers, he does mention Aristotle as a disciple of Plato.
That's right. And so I'm my hunch, and I could be wrong, is that this question is being debated among the Platonists. Who is capable of happiness? What is happiness? And it popped out at me. Slaves can be happy. In other words, because Augustine is taking what's true about what these philosophers have said about happiness, but now taking it to the Christian understanding, which happiness is found in God, and ultimately. And in any case, I just thought that popped out at me.
Okay, but again, I'm speaking from partial ignorance here, but Augustine may well have known that Aristotle was Plato's disciple in a sense, but he probably did not have access to many, if any, of the writings of Aristotle.
Right. I acceded to your point. I'm simply saying that the question of whether or not slaves can be happy might very well have been discussed by other Platonists besides Aristotle.
It might have been, but I think, again, here's ignorance, but I'm not sure Aristotle said that slaves could not be happy, because he considered slaves a natural category, and in any natural category, you can be happy when you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And being a slave, you be a good slave, and you'd be happy. I would suspect that's what Aristotle would say if he says that slavery is a natural condition.
Well, and Aristotle himself was a slave. So, but I will find the passages that I'm thinking of and bring them to your attention later.
Okay.
But what Aristotle said, what Aristotle didn't say, the point is that whoever might have thought they couldn't be happy, Augustine is correcting the record.
Well, but again, we don't know for sure that anybody did think that. You're saying because Aristotle talked about natural slavery, that therefore Aristotle also talked about slaves not being really happy. Whether Aristotle taught it or not, you're saying, well, then it was still in the air, it was discussed. Well, we don't know it was discussed. You know, it may be true. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying I don't think we have evidence for that.
Okay, so I will find you the textual sources that I'm thinking of,
Okay.
and we can talk about it later and maybe
Okay.
see what we can see.
All right.
What about bottom of page 216? I'm not a trained theologian or a trained philosopher, and I suspect many of the people watching this aren't either. So I found this very interesting and useful. So he's obviously quoting Varro, three kinds of theology. That is, three kinds of explanatory accounts of the gods. So pagan theology. Of these, one is called mythical, another physical, and the third civic. So the physical, he also says, can be called natural, and later on he says cosmic. The mythical is related to stories, and what I find very interesting here, sort of just to put C.S. Lewis beside Augustine, they call mythical the theology used chiefly by the poets, physical that used by the philosophers, and civic that used by the people in general. So mythic theology is how theology is presented in poetry and story and drama, and the classics, presumably. The philosophers, obviously, it's physical or natural theology. And then he says, in the first kind, in other words, mythical, there are many fictions that are contrary to the dignity and nature of the immortals. That everything is attributed to the gods that can happen to a man, even to the lowest and most contemptible of men. So the anthropomorphism of the gods in the myths, and what a great injury is done to the nature of the gods by these lying fables. So, I just that, in Lewis's book, The Pilgrim's Regress, he said that because the pagans had forgotten how to read, that God sent them pictures. In other words, it was through the use of the myths that God revealed himself to the pagans, because they no longer knew the law, and obviously he also revealed himself through reason, through philosophy. But in other words, that this, which Augustine seems to be quoting approvingly, it seems to be dismissing to me Sophocles and Homer, and if that's the case, then I'm uncomfortable with it.
Well, the argument, and this is the argument that Socrates also made, which is why he's put to death in Athens for blaspheming the gods, because Socrates said that if a real god would not be committing adultery and lying and cheating and doing all these things that we see in some of the myths. So we have to purify the myths, if you will. Like, for example, when Zeus is doing good, we can say with Lewis and others, or an understanding of Zeus's power, whatever, we can say with Lewis and others, okay, so here's a glimmer of some attributes of God. But when Zeus commits adultery against his wife and makes himself into a swan and seduces a maiden, or all the other things that we see him doing, right, which are what men do, I think Lewis
I've
also
never made
would
myself
say...
into a swan.
What?
I've never made myself into a swan, but go ahead.
Are you Zeus?
I could identify as one, though, I suppose.
Well, all these stories where Zeus is turning himself into other things in order to rape young women. Okay, so I think Lewis would agree that this is beneath the dignity of God, beneath the dignity of the divine, which is what Socrates said.
Yeah, my problem would really be, Vivian, that he seems to be dismissing all mythical theology, not just the bad stuff. And of course, he's giving examples of anthropomorphism and gods behaving in a manner which is beneath the dignity of what we understand is divine.
Well, you
And I
have to
understand
remember
all
that.
that, and I'm agreeing with you. I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying, but I do think that we do. Again, I'm just seeking clarity. That stories can be conveyors of theological truth, and that's certainly true in Homer and in Sophocles. So it's not. I'm just uncomfortable with just dismissing, the whole mythical approach to theology. That's all.
Well, we have to remember too what Augustine is doing here. He's quoting this guy Varro, and he's trying to pull out from what he's saying things that Augustine agrees with from a Christian point of view. And I'm only saying that that Socrates also thought this way, that some of these fables do a disservice to the divine. And so I think it's a legitimate criticism of some of this mythology, and that when we learn from it as Christians, we're learning from it with a Christian lens and a Christian purifying lens.
I agree completely, Vivian. That
Yeah.
with some of the myths, no problem. He's not saying some. He seems to be a carte blanche here. And also, I'm all in favour of historical context when we're looking at an author. So yes, of course, it's important for us to know what Augustine's doing, who his audience is, who he's addressing, and who he's trying to convert, and the Christianity he's trying to defend. So I understand all that, and I have no problem with that. But obviously, we're discussing the book in the 21st century amongst ourselves as Catholics, and that if there's a part of the book where he seems to be dismissing the role of myth as a conveyor of theological truth, I just really wanted to just raise not an objection, but a clarification.
Well, notice how he goes right after this, the discussion of the myths and fables themselves, to the cults of these gods and the kinds of behaviors that were done, temple prostitution and so on. And the things that were going on in some of these cults in Rome and in Greece too, are as and if the rites brought out into the light are so detestable, can we imagine anything good of the rites that remained in darkness? I mean, this is the top of page 220.
I mean, I'm not arguing with you. I've done what I wanted to do. I wanted to clarify.
And then Augustine builds the argument later on that, the things that these if these spiritual beings leading human beings to do these debauched things in order to honor and worship them can be nothing other than demons. And then he even quotes St. Paul later on in the chapter, much later in the chapter, on page 232.
I think the question is, does in the City of God Augustine equate all myths with lying fables? On page 217, he says in the middle of the page there before the new paragraph, Varro clearly stated, without even the least shadow of ambiguity, what a great injury is done to the nature of the gods by these lying fables.
Right.
So the question is, does that mean these as opposed to those fables, the lying versus the non-lying? Or is Augustine accepting a position here that sees all mythology as lying fables? I don't know the answer, but that's the question.
I don't either. But even when you read,
is just to raise a clarifying signal. That's all. I'm not trying to, argue even against Augustine. I just want to make perfectly clear that it's not the view of Christianity per se that truth cannot be conveyed in fictional stories.
I think we all agree to that.
But then you even, like you mentioned Homer, for example, and now you're going to have to, as a Christian, use that discerning art to see, well, the gods don't always look that great, all right, in the Iliad. How the whole war began, a jealousy among three goddesses and the rest of it. So, the wrath and so on of
Why preceding fall, the inklings that Zeus has the divine attributes of omniscience, omnipotence in certain places. So yes, discernment's necessary. There's no doubt at all that many of the gods are dysfunctional, and there's no doubt at all that in some of the ways that Zeus himself behaves is dysfunctional. I'm not trying to defend the Greek gods. I'm trying to say that Homer teaches valuable lessons about pride being destructive, anger being destructive, magnanimity and forgiveness being good. And these are all truths that are, and somehow or other the divine, the will of Zeus is accomplished. There's a providence at work. So, those sorts of things are part of what Tolkien would call the splintered fragments of the one true light that emerged through myth.
That's right. That's right. I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just trying to explain what I see in the book.
I'm not disagreeing with you, Vivian, or necessarily with Augustine. I just wanted clarification.
Yeah.
Yes. Moving forward, I'm still waiting to get to page 228 for a very brief quote.
I've got other stuff. I'm happy to let you go to 228, quite frankly.
So there's nothing prior to 228 you want to say? Well, we can always go backwards too. We've done that a little bit already, but the new paragraph there, he simply says, no one has come closer to us than the Platonists, which to me is another clue that he didn't have many of Aristotle's writings, because I think, although there's great Platonism in Thomas Aquinas, I think most people would say that Aristotle's hylomorphism of seeing, spirit and matter united is more consonant with Christian sacramental theology that sees spiritual realities expressed in physical things, even though Plato is also very, very present in the Christian tradition. In fact, you probably read this. It's been said by someone who really had the right to say it, but it was kind of it was offhand, that all philosophy is but a footnote to Plato.
Yeah, I mean, what you say there, I mean, there is a suggestion, of course, that the difference between Plato and Aristotle, and the fact that Augustine is a Platonist, in the middle of page 229, when he's talking about the Platonists, and says, in the middle of the page, they rank the intelligible form higher than the sensible form. We call sensible those things which can be perceived by the body's sight and touch, and we call intelligible those which can be understood by the perception of the mind. Whereas, of course, Aristotle and Aquinas take a more sacramental view that we actually have to go through the senses to actually make intelligible sense to our minds. So, without being able to engage sensually with the reality around us, we cannot make sense of anything intelligibly. So it's not that one exists separate or divorced from the other, that the sensible is as important as the intelligible, and they sort of, if you like, there's something incarnational about it, which Aquinas sees in Aristotle, and that would tend to suggest that, because he doesn't even address it particularly, that Augustine doesn't know Aristotle, because if he did, you'd think he'd be looking at Aristotle's perspective as distinct from Plato's, where he doesn't seem to do that.
As greater minds than my own have said, Aristotle corrected Plato on some important points.
Yes.
I'll agree with that, and I don't have a greater mind than you.
I really do love at the bottom of 230 when Augustine, alluding to the Platonists, is saying that, and they have stated that the light of the mind, which is at work in all human learning, is the very same God by whom all things were made. And that has been a recurring theme in a lot of our conversations about other books. This correspondence between the Logos and our own minds. That there is a conversation going on there that makes sense, that we can depend on. Anyway, that popped out at me.
And there's I think, a quite beautiful summary statement on page 231, the new paragraph there in the middle, summary of what he's reviewed these philosophers. He says, any philosophers then who held these views concerning the supreme and true God, namely, that he is the author of created things, the light by which things are known, and the good for the sake of which things are done, and that it is from him that we receive the principle of nature, the truth of doctrine, and the happiness of life, we rank above the rest, we acknowledge that they stand closest to us. This is true whether these philosophers are most popularly called Platonists or whether they apply some other name to their school. But so that he doesn't really care who the philosopher is, but if the philosopher affirms these things, then he's close to us,
Yep.
Principles of nature, truth of doctrine, happiness of life. So you got basically truth and goodness here.
Yep. Which also suggests my creeping suspicion that Augustine's a little bit puritanical tendency in the sense there's not much talk about the beauty. It's not what he's doing. And again, I don't want to pick arguments with him. He's a doctor of the church, but it's not what he's doing. But it's not an approach he takes or seems to be particularly interested in. That's all I'm saying.
Oh beauty, ever ancient, ever new. Late have I loved thee. I sought thee outside myself when they were inside myself. So I don't know. It'd be interesting to see. Right. There's probably some theses done on this about Augustine and beauty. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know where he stands on that.
That's a very good riposte, though, and I accept it. Touche.
I was also struck on 232. This section on Platonic Demonology that I mentioned earlier. A Christian will be on guard against those who shape their philosophy in accord with the elements of this world and not in accord with God, by whom the world itself was made. And think about what the modern equivalents of this idolatry are. Materialism, which will not accept that there's anything higher than the material world, is just idolatry with a new face.
And also, if you read that hideous strength, it's also demonic, even if it doesn't know it.
Well, this section, by the way, is on the demonic.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. And again, I think what we see here is that that the gods fall into two categories. Gods here in the sort of very much lowercase point, not in the sense that we've been talking about Plato having an understanding of a god, right? The god who is the creator, but there's also these other gods, right? That are lesser gods, and that accords with Homer. And some of them are evil, and some of them are good. The gods that are good live on a higher level of being, and presumably they do not desire evil, which would make them very angelic in our understanding of cosmology. And then you have below that these demons that have wicked appetites and supernatural powers. And again, that sort of would conform with our understanding of what we would call demons, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Moving forward, I've got something on 241. Anybody want to
As far as I'm concerned, no, I'm happy for you to go there.
I'd like to point out, we mentioned in a previous conversation something about a bit of humor lacking in Augustine.
Yeah.
But in this chapter, he gets a little sarcastic, doesn't he? So on page 238, he's talking about this Egyptian Hermes fellow. And, as if anything could be, this is the top of 238, as if anything could be more wretched for a person than to be under the dominion of a figment of his own imagination. It is easier for a man to stop being human by virtue of worshiping things of his own making as if they were gods than it is for things of his making to start being gods by virtue of his worshiping them. And there's another moment of sarcasm too. He really goes hard on this, against this Apuleius. But this, that's much farther along. But on this topic of making jokes, I just have to point it out on 251, where no doubt it was difficult for such an eminent philosopher to know or feel confident about refuting the whole society of the demons, which any little old Christian woman has no doubt exists and feels completely free to detest. I had to point out those little chuckles because we were noting how a bit humorless Augustine seemed to be.
Well, that was, I believe, a comment made by von Balthasar.
Was it von Balthasar?
It was in a footnote, yeah.
I couldn't remember where it was, but
yeah,
I chuckled at both of these passages.
Yeah, I don't. Somewhere we discussed it before, but that was a Balthasarian footnote. By the way, sidebar on Apuleius and the idea of Christians purifying myths. Perhaps C.S. Lewis's greatest book was Till We Have Faces, which is a myth. The subtitle is A Myth Retold. And he's telling the Apuleian myth of Psyche and Eros, I recommend that book to everyone listening or watching this if you haven't read it, or if you have read it, read it again.
I agree. And just for the record, I love stories and fables and myths. I have like a steady diet of them.
We know you do, Vivian. But again, ironically, and bearing in mind the discussion we've had here, the reason that C.S. Lewis thought that was his greatest book is it was the one that he believed was most mythical and least preachy. In other words, it was the time he managed to sort of just tell the story as a myth and let it sort of be subsumed within it rather than be floating on the surface as a point to be made. So the fact is that what he thought was his greatest work of literature was the one that's most mythical.
But did he say that, or are you surmising that?
No, he says, I think it's in one of his letters. I can't quote your chapter and verse, but he does actually, he considered Till We Have Faces to be his greatest work. He thought he liked that hideous strength until
I know that I've read the text where he says that's his best work, but I mean that he gave the reason why he thought it was the best. I don't know. Was that in there too?
Oh well, that's a good point. That might be my surmising. I'd have to go back and dig deeper to give you an answer to that.
Whatever. I mean, it's an extraordinary book, and it does communicate, I think, better in some ways because of the mythological clothing in which he incarnates these wonderful ideas, and can do it, therefore, on different levels. I mean, you read that book, and there's something personal, something familial, something social, something cosmic. It's all interwoven. I want to quote this. Oh, go ahead.
No. You. I say, what was your quote? You've been trying to say your 242, whatever it was.
So this is on page 241, the first part of the section called "The True Mediator." I like this. But if, and this is the far more credible and likely view, all men, so long as they are mortal, are necessarily miserable. So that may be a point against us being having a sense of humor, that if because we're mortal, we're miserable as well.
It certainly made us laugh. Maybe it's a joke.
then we must seek an intermediary who is not only man, but is also God. So that, and here's the typical Augustinian, I don't know, there's a name for it, I'm sure, where he takes two words, where, so that the blessed mortality of this intermediate may be by his intervention, lead men from their mortal misery to blessed immortality. So you see, we got misery compared to blessedness, and mortal with immortal. So lead us from our mortal misery to our blessed immortality. But that's Augustinian to the core, the way he writes.
Yeah,
but do we agree that the more credible, likely view is that all of us, as long as we are mortal, are necessarily miserable? Well, not all the time, anyway.
Yes, we have joy in this life, but the state that we're in is rather pathetic.
It is, but no, but we have the Triduum coming up. There is much for us to be joyful about. And all I have to do is look out the window and see a tree, and I can be on my knees and praise to God. So I don't think that we're meant to. I mean, it's almost Manichaean to not see the beauty around us and the beauty that God's done for us, and not have our hearts leap for joy. So
absolutely. Absolutely,
Sweet
but
and
to
sour. Sweet and sour.
recognize, absolutely, but for all that beauty and all that joy, if the state we were in was not so bad, would God have suffered what he did to save us from it? The very reflection on the passion that we're about to go through. Why
Yes,
would God do this? Why would
but-
he need to do
But then
this?
God so loves us that he did it.
Exactly.
That in
Exactly.
itself,
He
you know,
loves us while we were yet sinners. He loves us. So
Yeah.
I'm not trying to say, oh, we're just groveling all day long on the ground and beating our chest and everything, and there's no joy and no beauty. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, anyone who knows how I live my life knows that's not how I am. I'm just saying, if our state were, in an objective sense, not somewhat miserable, God would not be condescending to come and save us out of it.
Again, it's the same
Well,
thing. It's somewhat miserable. No one's going to disagree with you, but that's not what he says.
Well, I
uh,
have to qualify. Excuse me. The only reason why I'm qualifying it is to try to meet your argument. I believe that the objective state that mankind is in fact miserable.
called the fallen state.
Exactly.
And, the Salve Regina, which is said at the end of every rosary, among other times, has that phrase that always strikes me. Gementes et flentes in hoc lacrimarum valley, mourning and weeping in this valley of tears. But I also want to make a statement here on the cur Deus homo est, why God became man. And there are two schools on that. And one school is that if man had not sinned, there'd be no incarnation. That's the O Felix Culpa school. We'll hear that in the preface for Easter Vigil. But there's another school, which is a Elizabeth school, saying, no, God created man with the intent of bringing him into his divine life, but the form in which that incarnation took place was determined by our free rejection of his initial invitation. I personally favor the latter school, but one can hold either one and still be a faithful Catholic.
There's a slight distinction between the incarnation itself. Like, yes, God made us in order to commune with us. He created us to commune with us. So you could say, yes, the incarnation would have been accomplished with or without our sin. But
you asked why did God come into this misery? Because he wanted to relieve us of it. And I'm saying that's not necessarily the reason why he came into the misery.
Okay, so let me finish the idea or the thought. Not just enter our humanity, but then suffer all of our suffering besides. So that he would not have to suffer that if we hadn't dished it up. That's all I'm trying to say.
All of this discussion is problematic in the sense of the tense, because as all of it is in God's omnipresence, right? It's not as if God said, "Well, if I do this and they do that," it's like he's playing a game of chess, right? I mean, in other words, he knows all of this, and so in other words, it's not a question of they might do this, they might do that.
We have to call time. We have to go. I mean, God does not know the future. God knows the eternal present. So he doesn't know what's going to happen ever. But now, so that's a big discussion. So I know I had the last word on this, but
that's okay.
But we're over our time, although it's been a very interesting conversation. One of the most interesting ones, I would say. But let's come back next week and continue on the doctrine of the two kingdoms. And it will be a couple of weeks or more before we get to the next book.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumbookclub.ignatius.com.